Greetings, dwellers of the dark. This video defends the first and most fundamental claim of the Apostles' Creed, that God exists, not as a matter of faith, but as a conclusion of reason. I will present what I believe to be the strongest available argument for God's existence, which is the argument from contingency. I will explain why it is stronger than the alternatives. I will present it in strict logical form, in natural language and informal notation, so that every step is transparent. I will then face the strongest objections head on, including the problem of divine hiddenness. That is, if God exists, why is his existence not more obvious? This is not apologetics in the popular sense. I'm not trying to win a debate here. I am trying to show as clearly as I can that the existence of a necessary ground for all contingent reality is the most rational conclusion available, and what that conclusion does and does not entail. The argument delivers generic theism, a necessary uncaused being upon which everything else depends. It does not by itself deliver Christianity. That requires further evidence, which will be the subject of other videos. In my last video on apologetics, I proposed that the ecumenical creeds, specifically the Apostles' Creed, give us the basic propositional content of Christianity. From that creed, I extracted 10 claims: God's existence, monotheism, Trinitarianism, God's creator role, Jesus' existence, Jesus' divinity, Jesus' biographical data in the Gospels, immortality of the soul, resurrection of the body, and the existence of the Church of all true believers. These claims are not independent of each other. Their probabilities condition each other. Some are foundational, others are downstream. And if you map the dependencies, a clear organization emerges. So claim 1 about God's existence is the most load-bearing proposition in the entire structure. If it falls, claims 2, 3, 4, 6, and 10 fall with it. The only claim that survives independently is claim 5, the historical existence of Jesus, which rests on historical evidence. This is why we start here, not because it is the easiest claim to defend, it is not, but because almost every else depends on it. Before I present the argument, I need to clear away a common confusion. Many people conflate two distinct questions. Question 1, is reality purely physical? The question of supernaturalism. And question 2, does God exist? The question of theism. These are not the same question. Supernaturalism is the thesis that reality is not exhausted by the physical, that there exist non-physical realities, such as consciousness, mental substance, perhaps non-physical agents. The hard problem of consciousness, the irreducibility of subjective experience to neural activity, and certain well-documented anomalous experiences all provide evidence for supernaturalism. But supernaturalism is not theism. You can have a supernaturalist universe with no God, a dualist cosmos with mind and matter but no creator, no governor, no necessary ground. Spirits floating around does not entail that anyone made them or the world. Supernaturalism is a necessary precondition for theism. If strict naturalism were true, theism would be ruled out automatically. But it is not itself an argument for God's existence. What I present today is an argument for theism specifically, for the existence of a necessary being upon which all contingent reality depends. There are 4 main lines of argument for God's existence that I take seriously. Let me survey them briefly so you can see why I'm putting the weight on contingency. The design argument infers an intelligent designer from the order, adaptation, and apparent purpose visible in nature. This is the oldest and most popular argument. It is also, in my assessment, the weakest. And the reason is Darwin. The biological instances of design, which are the most impressive and where the argument has historically been concentrated, are precisely the ones where natural selection provides a powerful alternative explanation. Evolution explains how complex arrangements arise from simple ones incrementally without requiring a designing intelligence at each step. The argument survives in a residual form as to why are there laws of nature at all, why these constants rather than others, but these are thin threads compared to the original biological case. So it's better than coincidence theories, but not much more. It is grabbing at straws. Human beings universally and natively posit supernatural person-like agencies. Every culture, without exception, has independently produced religion. The tendency is stubborn, persistent, present from infancy, and connected to deep features of human cognition, like agency detection, design, stance, reasoning, the sense of dependence. The problem here is precision. At a basic level, this tendency gives very little. Supernatural person-like agency is compatible with a lot of things, like animism, polytheism, ancestor worship, monotheism, and everything in between. The variety of religions attests to the imprecision of this faculty. It tells you something is there, but it does not tell you what it is. So it's genuine evidence, but mixed in reliability. Maybe it's part of the cumulative case, but it's not a standalone argument. If the relevant features of the world had a beginning, they require a cause. The universe, or at least the present configuration of the universe, appears to have had a beginning based on Big Bang cosmology, the second law of thermodynamics, and the expansion of spacetime. So, what caused it? The argument has force, but it is vulnerable on two fronts. First, cosmological models are not settled. Cyclic models, quantum gravity proposals, and eternal inflation scenarios all attempt to push the beginning further back or eliminate it. Second, even granting a beginning, the argument only establishes a cause of the universe's beginning, not a necessary ground of its continued existence. It gives you a deistic first domino, not necessarily an ongoing sustainer. So it has some moderate force, but depends on empirical cosmology that is still in flux. And then there is the argument from contingency. To me, this is the strongest line, and I want to explain why. Unlike the design argument, it is not undermined by evolutionary biology. Unlike native theism, it does not depend on the reliability of an imprecise faculty. Unlike the beginning argument, it does not depend on whether the universe had a temporal origin, even an eternal universe if contingent requires a necessary ground. The argument operates at the most fundamental level of metaphysics. It asks, why is there anything contingent at all? Why are there beings that could have not existed? And it shows that the chain of contingent explanations, however long, even infinite, cannot ground itself. Something non-contingent is required. It is also the argument with the most distinguished intellectual pedigree: Aristotle, Avicenna, Aquinas, Leibniz, and in the contemporary literature, you have Pruss and Rasmussen, all developed versions of it. I will present my own version and explain why I think it improves on recent formulations. Here is the argument. It has four premises, two intermediate conclusions, and one final ultimate conclusion. Premise 1. Contingent things exist, things whose existence depends on causes external to themselves. Premise 2. If contingent things exist, then a causal external to them exists. First conclusion, a cause of contingent things exist. Premise 3, every existing thing is either contingent or necessary, not both at the same time. Second conclusion, from the first conclusion and premise 3, this cause is either contingent or necessary. Premise 4, if there is at least one thing causing contingent things, then that thing is not contingent, but causes all contingent things. From the second conclusion in premise 4, therefore, there is at least one necessary thing that causes all contingent things. So 4 premises, 2 intermediate conclusions, 1 ultimate conclusion. The argument is deductively valid. If you accept the premises, the conclusion follows necessarily. So premises 1, 2, and 3 are relatively uncontroversial. But premise 4 is where the weight falls. It is the premise that does the decisive work, and it is the premise that requires the most careful defense. I will defend premise 1 through premise 3 briefly, and then give premise 4 the extended treatment it demands. Now, for those who want to see the logical skeleton stripped bare, here is the same argument in first-order logic. So the formal translation confirms what the natural language version shows. The argument is deductively valid. Premise 4 compresses a substantial amount of philosophical reasoning into a single premise. The formal skeleton states it. The defense of premise 4 justifies it. Now, let us go to justification. You exist. You came into existence at a specific time. You depend on oxygen, food, gravity, the sun, the nuclear forces holding your atoms together, and you can cease to exist at any moment if any of these things cease to be the case. You're not the ground of anything, and the world we keep spinning once you're gone. The same is true of every material object you have ever encountered. This premise is about as secure as any premise can be. This is the causal principle. It says, a thing that exists due to the concurrence of 100 external factors does not contain within itself the explanation for why it exists rather than not. Something else brought it into existence and sustains the conditions for its continued existence. We have never observed a contingent thing that came into existence uncaused. The principle is supported by all of scientific practice and by ordinary experience. And this is the law of excluded middle applied to contingency combined with the law of non-contradiction. A thing either depends on something external for its existence, or it does not. There is no third option. Nothing can both depend and not depend. Now, premise 4. Premise 4 is a premise that does the decisive work, like I said. It says, if there is at least one thing causing contingent things, then that thing is not contingent, but causes all contingent things. This is a strong claim, and it requires extended justification. The justification has two parts corresponding to the two conjuncts of premise 4. Why the cause must be non-contingent. Suppose the cause of contingent things is itself contingent. Then by premise 2, it too requires a cause external to itself. If that further cause is also contingent, premise 2 applies again and again. The result is a series, potentially infinite, in which every member is contingent. Every member requires external causes. No member has the ground of its own existence in itself. Now, does such a series considered as a whole explain why contingent things exist? In my opinion, it does not. Each member of the series merely pushes the explanatory demand one step further back. The demand is never satisfied. It is only postponed. An infinite chain of boxcars, each pulled by the one in front, still needs a locomotive. Adding more boxcars, even infinitely many, does not solve the problem. Moreover, the series itself, if composed exclusively of contingent members, is itself contingent. Every member requires an external cause, so the whole series also requires something external to fall the first domino piece. A contingent series requires an external cause just as much as an individual contingent thing does. We are back where we started with the same demand. This recursive structure of contingent causation, contingent things needing causes, those causes possibly being contingent, generating further demands endlessly, does not constitute an explanation. It constitutes the refusal to explain. The demand for an external cause generated by the very definition of contingency can only be satisfied by something that does not reproduce the demand, something that is not itself contingent, something that exists from itself, uncaused, having the ground of its own existence in its own nature, a non-contingent cause. And this reasoning is not deductive, it is abductive. It's an inference about explanatory adequacy. The anti-regress principle that recursive contingent causation is not explanatorily acceptable is a philosophical judgment. It's not a logical theorem. The brute fact advocate will reject it. He will say something like, the recursive loop just is, there is no further explanation. Things are contingent all the way down. But the regress problem created by assuming that only contingent things exist makes the contingent explanation strictly worse than the non-contingent one. It directly violates the widely accepted criterion of Occam's razor. When explaining something, posit the fewest entities necessary. An infinite chain of contingent causes, each one reproducing the demand for another, is an incomparably larger ontological commitment than positing at least one non-contingent ground, even though the two are qualitatively different kinds of entity. The parsimonious move is not to multiply contingent causes without end, but to terminate the chain in something that does not reproduce the demand. I think the demand for explanation is legitimate, and that its indefinite postponement is not its satisfaction. But I acknowledge that this is a philosophical commitment, not a proof. Premises 4's second conjunct rests on this commitment. The viewer should know that this is where the argument's most controversial weight falls. Why the cause must be universal? Premise 4 also asserts that whatever causes contingent things causes all of them. Why? Because the argument's reasoning applies to every contingent thing without exception. P2 says, if contingent things exist, a cause external to them exists. This does not distinguish between some contingent things and others. every contingent thing, by virtue of being contingent, requires a cause external to itself. And the anti-regress reasoning just given shows that this cause must ultimately be non-contingent. If there were two independent non-contingent causes, one grounding some contingent things, another grounding others, this would be compatible with the argument's logic. Premise 4 does not strictly require a single cause. It requires that every contingent thing has a non-contingent cause. The all in premise 4 means the scope of non-contingent causation covers every contingent thing, not just some. Whether this is achieved by one non-contingent cause or several is a further question, one that the monotheism argument addresses in a later video. The conclusion, C3, is therefore, there exists at least one non-contingent thing that causes all contingent things. The at least one is very deliberate. The contingent argument alone does not establish that there is exactly one necessary being. It establishes that at least one exists. Again, monotheism requires further reasoning. Now, you may wonder why this formulation rather than others in the contingency family. Let's look at Leibniz' argument first, as it is laid down On the Ultimate Origination of Things. What I'm going to do here is to reduce his longer free-flowing prose into a semantic core. That is, the bare meaning of what he says, trying to stay faithful to his thought. And I'm going to follow the same order of ideas in his text. It looks like this. There is an aggregate of finite things, the world, and a dominant unity of a much nobler kind. This unity rules, makes, and is superior to the world. It is extra-mundane and is the ultimate reason of things. He then justifies why this thing is extra-mundane and the ultimate reason of things. Why is there an extra-mundane ultimate reason? Because neither the world nor any of its individual parts are sufficient reasons for themselves. Why? Because succeeding states just follow from each other. State 1 is a reason for state 2, and state 2 for state 3, but what about state 0 and state -1, etc.? None of these states says anything about why the series exists in the first place. Why? Because an infinite set of insufficient reasons will never amount to at least one sufficient reason. They always give you more of the same. Hence, it has to be something else of a different kind. Why? Because the distinction between cause and reason blocks the escape route of eternity. Eternity removes the need for a cause. No beginning, no first event to cause. But it does not remove the need for a reason. Nothing within a contingent series, however eternal, provides that reason. Only an ultimate extra-mundane reason qualifies, and that is God. Then he answers, what is this extra-mundane thing that is the ultimate reason of everything? This ultimate extra-mundane thing is not like the things in the world, which may be physically necessary because they determine the immediate next state causally. It is something absolute, something of metaphysical necessity, something for which no further reason can be given, but which provides sufficient reason for everything else. And since only existing things can ground other existing things, and the world cannot ground itself, this extra-mundane thing must ground the world in a metaphysically necessary way. It must be essentially existing. Existence belongs to its nature. The world is given existence. The ultimate thing exists by nature. Leibniz' argument, reconstructed in standard form, runs as follows. The world exists and requires a sufficient reason for its existence. That reason cannot be found within the world, even if the world is eternal. There are only mundane and extra-mundane things. Therefore, the sufficient reason for the world is extra-mundane. The ground of things is either physically or metaphysically necessary. Physically necessary grounding cannot ground itself. Therefore, necessity requires metaphysical necessity to be grounded. The world can only provide physically necessary grounding. Therefore, the world requires metaphysically necessary grounding. Therefore, the world requires an extra-mundane, metaphysically necessary thing as its reason. The argument is valid, which you would expect from somebody like Leibniz, but is unsound. It is formally correct, but with a problem in the quality of the premises. The worst problem is one I have encountered many times reading philosophy of religion, which is smuggling in the conclusion. What Leibniz smuggles in is monotheism, and he does it through an informal fallacy that has no standard name but can be described precisely. He treats sufficient reason and the thing that is the reason as the same concept, both always in the singular. But why? We can perfectly well conceive that the explanatory or grounding entity is a plurality of things in complex relations. Just because X requires a sufficient reason, R, for its existence, it does not follow that R is a single entity. Monotheism has to be argued for separately. An argument for the existence of God does not do everything. It establishes existence, not uniqueness. The less serious problem is that the argument tries to prove more than it needs to and demands more metaphysical commitments than are necessary. There is no need to establish that the grounding entity must be extra-mundane. We only need to establish that the contingency requires a necessary being to ground it. And we do not need the extra-mundane-mundane dichotomy, the distinction between physical and metaphysical necessity, the principle of sufficient reason, talk of essences or specious analogies to make the case for the existence of God via the grounding need of a necessary being. At least one necessary being, I should say, as my own argument makes explicit. My argument is better on both counts. It contains no fallacies, formal or informal, and it does not smuggle in conclusions that belong to later arguments. It correctly infers that there is at least one non-contingent cause, not exactly one, and it is more elegant in the precise sense of the word. It does the same work with less metaphysical baggage. It has 4 premises, standard concepts, no special vocabulary, and every quantification claim is explicit and auditable. Now, let's turn to Pruss and Rasmussen's version of the contingency argument. For any particular contingent concrete things, there is an explanation of the fact that those things exist. Considering all the contingent concrete things that exist, if there is an explanation of the fact that those things exist, then there is a necessary concrete thing. Therefore, there is a necessary concrete thing. At first sight, the problem with this argument is that it leaves too much to be argued for outside of it. Finding the right balance here is not easy. How much of the justification should stay outside the premises? A simple syllogism about something this complex will, of course, push much of the reasoning out of the main argument. The problem with doing that is that it leaves much of the reasoning outside any proper framework in which it could be audited. Prose justifications are not as precise as a standard form argument when it comes to concepts, logical connections, quantification, and modality. This makes refutation harder to pinpoint, which is not good scientific practice. And with that said, before proceeding to the formal translation, the next point concerns the wording. This is a more superficial critique, but important nonetheless, because our choice of words in natural language argumentation does the same work that notation does in formal logic or mathematics. And that work matters. The problem here is a lack of consistency in the wording. At first sight, the authors seem to intend a modus ponens, but it is not clear how the statement in premise 1 is the antecedent of the conditional in premise 2. Is it even a modus ponens? They never clarify this in the prose. And why is it unclear that the statement in 1 is the antecedent of the conditional in 2? Because in premise 1, the subject is particular contingent concrete things, whereas in premise 2, the subject is contingent concrete things. Is there a difference between particular contingent concrete things and contingent concrete things? Is the adjective particular doing any modifying work? Is it just verbal filler, or is it doing something else? Well, I think it is doing something else, but the argument should be clear at first sight, even in standard natural language form. Let me dig into this. One way to clarify what is happening beneath the natural language is to formalize the argument, and the authors do exactly that. Unfortunately, their formalization makes the argument even more confusing. Take a look at it yourself. Now, what on earth is this variable? Why are they mixing set theoretic notation like this one with fall notation? What kind of predicate is this one when standard notation normally calls for a single uppercase letter? What logical system and what notation is this? Even before asking what system this is, it is not clear how this formula connects to this one. That is, how either could be inferred from the other. Assuming basic full, where is the quantifier for the variable x in Cx? You cannot have a free variable in a closed formula. Does the universal quantifier for xs somehow also bind x? Is that a special rule of the system? And what about this one? What rules govern it? Does it mean what it means in set theory or something else? Even at the level of the ordinary connectives, such as this one and this one, the two formulas do not look equivalent or mutually inferable. Let me show what I mean. Let's eliminate the quantifiers first, something we would have to do to run a natural deduction on these formulas. Assume for now that the quantifiers for this one behave like ordinary singular quantifiers, like this. Now, we hit a problem, precisely because of the free variable. How are we supposed to apply a quantifier elimination rule to x when there is no quantifier to eliminate? And the choice of elimination rule matters since it differs between the universal and existential cases. With no rule to follow, I will arbitrarily assume the constant c, such as this. Now let's do this to the other formula. So we now have... Now, even after this simplification, it is not at all clear how this formula and the antecedent are equivalent, or how either could be inferred from the other. In fact, it is clear that they do not have the properties required to do that. Now, two separate problems are tangled here, and I want to keep them apart. The first is merely a side effect of my arbitrary instantiation. The terms do not match, such as these or these. A defender could rightly say, I created this mismatch by my own naming choices, so let me set it aside and grant complete consistency across all terms, like this. This brings out the second problem, which is the real one, and which does not depend on any instantiation choice. To perform the modus ponens and reach this, I need the antecedent of the second premise
this one, to be derivable from the first premise, this one. But this is impossible. There is no rule that transforms a conditional whose consequent is this one, and whose antecedent is itself a conditional, into a conjunction having this one as one conjunct. The first premise delivers this only as the consequent of a conditional. The second premise demands this as a conjunct in its antecedent. Nothing bridges the two. So if the author's goal is to reach the conclusion by modus ponens, these premises cannot do it. The argument, taken at face value, is not even valid. Set it aside the particular problem from a moment ago. Once formalized, the argument is shown to be invalid. And on top of that, it may have a syntactic defect in its premises. Recall the free variable x in Cx. But perhaps I am assuming too much just by looking at it. Let's see what the authors say about their own formalization. According to them, the quantifiers for this one are plural quantifiers, not ordinary full quantifiers. They also say that this one does not work like set-theoretic membership. So how does this one work in this system? And what system is it exactly? Then they say this: readers who prefer singular quantification are welcome to interpret the argument in terms of facts about sets or classes of contingent concrete things. But if the system is that elastic, if it makes no difference whether we read it as plural quantification or as ordinary full over sets, then there is no expressive or functional advantage to the plural apparatus, since it does exactly the same work. And this is the crucial point. The authors themselves license the full with sets reading. Under that reading, the one they explicitly authorize, the argument is invalid, as I showed above, even in its most charitable form with consistent terms and no syntactic errors. That is decisive. Everything else they say about the argument simply assumes it is already grammatical and valid, and treats the remaining task as one of explaining and justifying the premises. But justifying the premises is the soundness step, and that step only makes sense when the premises are well formed and the argument is valid. We never got there, so there is nothing further to discuss. Neither about the formal version, whose underlying logic does not work, nor about the natural language version, which never made clear whether particular modifies contingent concrete things at all. Still, before declaring the argument a complete mess, I should look more closely at this plural quantification business. As far as I can find, plural quantification was proposed by the philosopher George Boulez. The system comes in two versions, PFO and POFO+. Which one are the authors using? They don't say. Their notation also departs from the standard conventions. Plural variables are conventionally written this way or this way, not this way. And the is one-of relation is conventionally written this way, not this way. Finally, once we check their formula against the actual formation rules of PFO+, the suspicion is confirmed. The variable x in Cx really is free. The universal quantifier binding xs cannot also bind x. As written, premise 1 is not a closed formula. It is an open formula, and an open formula has no truth value, so it cannot serve as a premise. If we follow PFO plus properly, the argument should look like this. Now the premises are grammatical by the rules of PFO plus. I had to treat the straight X as a slip on the author's part, since in the second premise the same mistake does not occur, though it reappears in their prose. At least this version is consistent across all its terms. Now the real question. With the correction made, is it valid? Of course not. The exercise we ran earlier under the full reading, which let us inspect the connectives more clearly, already showed that the antecedent of the conditional in the second premise cannot be derived from the statement in the first. That remains true even with the errors corrected and with a proper system PFO plus in the background. So I did everything I could to push this argument through to the soundness step, where we would finally weigh the truth of its premises. I couldn't get there. It is simply a bad argument. Any argument that survives the validity step is better than one that does not, and mine does. On that ground alone, my argument is better. Now, why can't the universe just be a brute fact? Why can't it exist for no reason at all? Not everything needs an explanation. Well, this objection targets the justification of P4, premise 4, specifically the anti-regress principle. The brute fact advocate says recursive causality is acceptable. The demand for explanation simply stops. Things are contingent all the way down. I see no reason to accept this. All of our experience and all of our regimented reasoning tells us that things do not pop into existence out of nothing. Even recent cosmological models that dispense with a single beginning, cyclic models positing an endless sequence of expansion, contraction, extinction, and regeneration, still have every universe arise from a previous one. Experience and disciplined reasoning alike suggest that everything which exists was caused by something else. What the argument showed is that things of this kind cannot do all the work. We also need at least one necessary thing that has always been here, whatever here turns out to mean. Consider the strongest version of the brute fact reply. An eternal cycle of contingent states. A big bounce or something like it, with no beginning at all. Doesn't an eternal cycle escape the need for a ground? It does not, and it is worth seeing exactly why, because the reason exposes an asymmetry between past and future that the objection ignores. Future-directed recursion among contingent things is unproblematic. Each state produces the next, indefinitely with no upper bound and no demand goes unmet, because we are not asking the future to ground the present. Past-directed recursion is a different matter entirely. Every contingent state demands a prior ground. Positing a prior cycle to supply it only relocates the demand to that cycle, which demand its own prior ground, and so on without end. A cycle, after all, is a pattern imposed on some material. The cycling describes how the material behaves, not why the material exists. So there must be a moment, call it T0, at which the material is introduced for the cycle to run at all. And no contingent predecessor can supply that moment. If cycle 1 is grounded in cycle 2, then cycle 2 needs a cycle 3, and the demand marches backward forever without ever being discharged. And this is the crux. The demand for a ground is structurally unsatisfiable within the domain of contingent things, not because we have failed to find the ground, but because every candidate ground reproduces the very demand it was meant to discharge. You may concede all the intracycle grounding you like. Grant that contingent states explain one another perfectly well from T0 forward to Tn. And the problem still bites at the boundary. T0 itself, the introduction of the material, has no possible contingent ground. Whatever you do with contingent things, you are only kicking the can down the road. This is why the regress is not merely unexplained, but impossible. Not impossible in the way a square circle is impossible, that is, a formal contradiction ruled out by logic alone. This is grounding impossibility. A contingent chain grounding its own past is impossible in the way that paying off a debt with an IOU that must itself be paid by another IOU forever is impossible. There is no formal contradiction in the description. There is a structurally guaranteed failure ever to discharge the obligation. The debt is never paid. The ground is never supplied. Future infinity is coherent. Past infinity for contingent things is not. An explanation is a description, the explanans, of how the object of our interest, the explanandum, is what it is or does what it does. If that description requires a configuration that can never, even in principle, supply the ground it demands, namely an infinite recursive chain of contingent causes reaching into the past, then we should neither accept it nor entertain it as a possible reality. To posit the impossible as a brute explanatory fact is not to explain. It is to abandon explanation while pretending to offer one. We are entitled to posit something as a brute fact only when it is consistent with our accumulated experience and our best regimented reasoning, and when there is no way to get under it or over it, no further ground to seek. A necessary being qualifies. It is the kind of thing whose existence needs no external ground because its ground is internal to its nature. An infinite regress of contingent things does not qualify. Every member of it demands a further ground, so the demand is never met, only deferred. That is the asymmetry. Brute necessity terminates the demand for explanation. Brute contingency merely refuses it. But why can't there just be an infinite chain of contingent causes, each explaining the next, with no need for unnecessary ground? The answer is already contained in the previous one. The brute fact objection asked why this infinite regress cannot be a foundational truth, inherently explanatory. This objection asks the more general question of what exactly is wrong with an infinite recursion of contingent causes. But the reason it cannot be a brute fact is the same as the reason the recursion is problematic in the first place. It cannot exist. We have no idea what the world would look like if it did, assuming that scenario is even coherent. As before, there is a moment in this recursion that requires the introduction of the contingent material, and that moment cannot be produced by another contingent event, since positing one only pushes the demand back a step and restarts the recursion. The chain never grounds itself. It only defers the ground forever. Maybe the universe itself is the necessary being. Maybe physical reality at its most fundamental level exists from itself. I think this might be the strongest objection of the lot. I think the best way to present it is through the mouth of the challenger themselves.
Well, you say the problem with contingent causation is that, however far back we travel, we never find the phenomena, the mechanism, the moment where the contingent material first starts interacting. And so we can never explain the existence of the material, its interactions, or the cyclic and endless character of the whole process, once it got going. Those are the deficiencies that keep the thing contingent. I can fix every one of them. First, the cosmos is not just objects. It is also energy, together with the laws that govern how energy behaves. And energy and its laws are necessary. They have always been here. Nothing brought them into existence. And, this is the key, nothing can take them out of existence. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. That's just the law. And a thing cannot be destroyed is a thing whose non-existence is impossible, which is exactly what necessary means. Think of an eternal computer. The machine and its operating rules are permanent and indestructible, and the programs it runs, particles, worlds, whole universes, are just transient arrangements shuffled endlessly according to those rules. The hardware is necessary. Only the software is contingent, and I only need the hardware. Second, once you grant me the necessary hardware, your demand for a moment of introduction just appears. I do not need a phenomenon, a mechanism, or a first instant where the material comes into place, because the transformative, on and off, cyclic behavior of the material is fully explained by the machine that produces it. The material behaves that way because the cosmos makes it behave that way. And this is not idle speculation. It is exactly what current cyclic cosmologic models describe. So I have found a home for a necessity inside the universe itself, and I have done it without agency, without personhood, without any godly powers bolted onto the necessary being.
I think this is the objection at full strength, and it is a good one. It has a named necessary being, a mechanism for everything I demanded, explained, and real physics to point at. Now, let me answer it. First pillar. Energy is not indestructible. Conservation of energy is not a brute axiom of the universe. It is a theorem, and it follows by Noether's theorem from one specific condition: time translation symmetry, the assumption that the laws of physics are the same at every moment. Where that symmetry holds, energy is conserved. Where it fails, energy is not conserved. And on cosmological scales, it fails because the universe is not the same at every moment. It is expanding. It is bigger now than it was. So, watch what actually happens to energy in an expanding universe. A photon traveling across billions of years loses energy on the way, cosmological redshift, and arrives carrying less than it left with. Where did the lost energy go? Nowhere. It is simply gone. It was not conserved. Dark energy does the opposite. As space expands and the volume grows, the dark energy density stays fixed, so the total energy goes up. Energy appearing out of nowhere as the universe grows, also not conserved. I'm not making up stuff here. Sean Carroll, an atheist cosmologist, says plainly that energy is not conserved in general relativity, and that the people insisting otherwise are clinging to a Newtonian habit, that general relativity throughout. So the challenger's founding claim, energy cannot be created or destroyed, is false. It holds locally in the lab over short distances and times. It does not hold for the universe as a whole. And the universe as a whole is the only thing this objection is about. The indestructible hardware is destructible after all. So pillar 1 is gone. Now, the second pillar. The shuffling is not eternal. It runs down. The challenger pictures an eternal computer perpetually shuffling. The physics predicts the exact opposite. The shuffling winds down and stops. This is the second law of thermodynamics. Usable energy degrades toward equilibrium. A universe left running heads toward a state, heat death, where no work can be done, no structure can form, and nothing more happens. So the shuffling does not go forever. If the cosmos had genuinely been shuffling for an infinite time, it would have reached equilibrium an infinite time ago. That means it would already be dead. The fact that it is not dead is direct evidence that the shuffling has not been running forever. The Challenger's eternal computer cannot have been running eternally because if it had, the screen would have gone black long ago. Now, putting the two together, energy is not indestructible. It genuinely bleeds away in an expanding universe. The shuffling is not self-sustaining. It winds down toward death. So the eternal computer is a machine that leaks its own operating power and is running down toward a stop. And now I get to ask the question I have been asking all along. If the material can be depleted, and the physics says it can, what puts it back? What winds the machine back up? Nothing inside the machine can. That is the whole content of the second law. No closed physical system winds itself back up. That is what closed plus second law together forbid. Here is where the Challenger reaches for the cavalry, and here is why it does not come. They will say, fine, then something winds it up, and we have mechanisms for the winding. Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology, the ekpyrotic cyclic model, loop quantum cosmology. So let's talk about these mechanisms then. They are not observed. They are still speculative physics, not established physics. And every one of them is a theoretical device built for the specific purpose of escaping the heat-death problem, which means each one carries exactly the same epistemic standing as the metaphysical claim it is supposed to rescue. Let me take them one at a time in plain terms. About Penrose's model. Roger Penrose proposes that the universe passes through vast successive epochs, and that at the end of each one, when every star has burned out, every black hole has evaporated, and nothing is left but massless radiation drifting through an enormous empty space, the universe somehow forgets its own accumulated disorder and starts fresh. The reset works by having the record of the past destroyed. The information about everything that happened has to genuinely vanish, mainly by falling into black holes and disappearing when those black holes evaporate. That is the linchpin. And the problem is that most physicists now think information is not destroyed that way, that it is preserved in some scrambled form rather than annihilated. Take away the information loss and the entropy does not reset, and Penrose's cycle does not restart clean. Heat death remains a problem to solve. Now, the ekpyrotic model. Steinhardt and Turok propose that our entire universe sits on a vast sheet, a brain, floating in a higher dimensional space, and that periodically it collides with a second sheet. Each collision is what we call a Big Bang. The impact dumps fresh energy into our universe and starts a new cycle. Before the objections, a word on what a brain is, because the name is misleading. It is not a membrane made of some material floating in a void. It is a region of space itself with fewer dimensions than the space it sits inside. Picture a flat sheet of paper in a room. The paper is a two-dimensional region inside a three-dimensional space, and it is not made of the air around it. Now, scale that up. Our entire universe, all three dimensions of space we can see and everything in them, is the sheet, and it sits inside a larger space with extra dimensions we cannot perceive, called the bulk. We are stuck on the sheet, We cannot see the room. Now, the two problems. First, to make this work, you have to posit an entire unobserved higher dimensional reality. Extra dimensions, a bulk, a second sheet, and whatever governs how the sheets move and collide. Nobody has ever observed any of it, and it is all contingent stuff of exactly the kind the argument is about, which means you have not escaped the question of what grounds the machine. Second, the entropy is not actually destroyed by the collision. It is only diluted, spread so thinly across an enormously expanded volume that each new cycle looks like tidy from the inside. But the total disorder still climbs from cycle to cycle. If it climbs going forward, then running the tape backward, it means it must shrink, converging on a beginning. So this model cannot deliver the eternal past it promised either. Now, loop quantum cosmology. This one proposes that when a universe collapses to extreme density, gravity turns repulsive so that instead of crushing down into a singularity, the universe bounces back out. This is a big bounce rather than a big bang. Now, where does the repulsion come from? It comes from the theory the model is built on. So it is worth saying what that theory is. Physics has two great frameworks that do not get along. General relativity, which describes gravity and treats spacetime as a smooth, continuous fabric, and quantum mechanics, which describes the very small and treats things as coming in discrete chunks. Both are spectacularly well confirmed in their own domains, and both break down where the other is needed, namely whatever enormous mass is crammed into a tiny volume, like black holes, the Big Bang. Physicists therefore need a theory of quantum gravity, a theory about how gravity behaves, where space-time is compressed to the smallest possible scales and must therefore obey quantum rules rather than the smooth, continuous ones general relativity assumes. And nobody has a confirmed one. Loop quantum gravity is one candidate, a rival to string theory, and what it proposes is that spacetime is not smooth at all, but granular, made of visible chunks with a smallest possible volume below which smaller stops meaning anything. The bounce follows from that. If there is a floor to how small a volume can be, then a collapsing universe cannot be crushed to an infinitely dense point because there is no infinitely small point to be crushed into. As the collapse approaches the floor, the granular structure of space resists, gravity flips, and the universe rebounds. It is the most physically respectable of the three, I think, because the bounce falls out of a serious attempt to quantize gravity rather than being bolted on to solve the heat-death problem. But it still has two soft spots. First, a bounce only tells you that the universe can rebound. It does not tell you that it rebounds to a tidy, low disorder state, which is the thing you need. Without a separate story about resettling the disorder, the entropy still piles up across bounces, and the sequence still cannot run forever into the past. Second, the whole edifice rests on loop quantum gravity being true, and loop quantum gravity has, to date, no experimental confirmation whatsoever. Not weak confirmation, none. It might be right. It might be entirely wrong. String theorists think it is wrong. Loop theorists think string theory is wrong. But the truth of the matter is, no one knows because there is no data about it. So the winding up mechanisms are speculation in a lab coat instead of speculation in an armchair with a smoking pipe. That is perfectly fine as physics in progress. It is not fine as a hard objection against the need for a different necessary ground, something different from what we can observe and elaborate on. The claim that the universe winds up itself and we have the models is far too weak to carry the objection. The models turn out to be unconfirmed, entropy-troubled constructions adopted for exactly the same reason a theist posits a ground, because the low entropy problem demands an answer, and something has to give it. The challenger could counter by pointing out that we are in an abductive competition. We both need an explanation grounded in necessity, and all I have shown is that his cosmology-based explanation runs into problems. But what about my theist explanation? Why should we discard the cosmology-based one in favor of mine? The reply to that objection comes next. Even if a necessary being exists, how do you get from necessary being to God? A personal, agent-like creator and sustainer. And why should I prefer your personal ground over a physical, impersonal one? A mind is a far more extravagant posit than a substrate. Occam's razor cuts against you, not for you. Well, this is more work for me to do. It is not enough to show that the challenger's cosmological ground fails. I did that, but the failure of one candidate does not establish another. Recall that video on presuppositionalism. This is exactly its followers' problem. Even if they succeed in falsifying an opposing worldview, that does not imply theirs is true. So I also have to show that the personal features of my candidate are theoretically more robust. If they are not, then the challenger is right and Occam cuts against me. I would be positing a mind where physical entities and relations do the job just fine, and that would be a worse explanation, not a better one. So the question is precise. Does an impersonal necessary ground do the explanatory work? And the answer is no. Here is why. Suppose a necessary being is impersonal, a physical substrate, a field, a law, a principle, whatever you like. It has no will, no capacity to select, no agency. It simply is what it is, and it produces what it produces by its nature automatically, with no alternatives. Now ask, how does an impersonal ground produce contingent reality? There are only two options, and both destroy the position. Option 1. It produces necessarily. Recall the candidate from the previous objection. The universe itself as a whole is a necessary being, energy and its laws, permanent and self-grounding, endlessly shuffling contingent arrangements within itself. If that ground operates by necessity, then whatever it produces follows from what it is, automatically, with no alternatives available. But now look at what that costs. If everything the ground produces follows necessarily from its nature, then the shuffle itself is necessary. This cycle, these laws, these constants, this particular unfolding rather than another, all of it had to be exactly as it is. And then the contingent arrangements inside the machine are not contingent at all. They are the necessary output of a necessary machine. The hardware-software split disappears. It is necessity all the way down, and the first premise of the argument that contingent things exist, the premise nobody disputes, is false. So the challenger has to say the opposite. The shuffle could have been otherwise. The laws could have taken different values. The cycle could have run differently. The arrangements are genuinely open. Good. That preserves the contingency. But now he owes an account of why this shuffle obtains rather than another. And that is precisely what a necessary impersonal ground cannot supply. Nothing in energy exists and cannot be destroyed, tells you why the constants are these ones or why the cycle runs this way. An impersonal ground has no means of settling between alternatives. It does not necessitate. It has no selector. An impersonal ground has no means of settling between alternatives. It does not necessitate. It has no selector. Which brings us to the second horn. Option 2. It selects among alternatives. The necessary universe could have produced itself as it is, or produced itself differently. Different laws, different constants, a different shuffle. It produced this one, so what did the selecting? Not the universe. Physics gives us a substrate that behaves according to its laws. It never gives us a substrate that chooses between laws it might have had. That is not an observation about what we have failed to find. It is a point about what an impersonal thing is. To select is to settle a matter that is not already settled, to determine an outcome among genuinely open alternatives where nothing in your nature forces the result. And a thing with no capacity to determine anything cannot determine which alternative obtains. It can only be what it is and do what its nature dictates. That is what impersonal means. But determination among real alternatives, unforced by necessity, is exactly what we mean by will. There is no third thing. You cannot have a selection without a selector. So either the shuffle was fixed by necessity, and we are back on the first horn where nothing is contingent, or something settled it. And whatever settles between open alternatives is, in the only sense the word has ever had, an agent. So the impersonal ground faces a fork with no exits. Make it act by necessity, and you lose the contingency of the world, which was the datum we started from. Make it act by selection, and we have smuggled in will and called it something else. This is why personhood is not an extravagance. It is not a feature I am adding to the necessary being because it suits my case for God. It is the only thing that explains the conjunction of a necessary ground with a contingent world. Occam does not cut against me here because Occam never told you to prefer the simpler explanation. He told you to prefer the simplest explanation that accounts for the facts. A bare substrate is simpler in the way that the milk was always on the floor is simpler than someone spilled it. Simplicity that fails to explain is not parsimony. Occam's razor applies among explanations that account for the facts. There is a second pressure pointing the same way, and it is independent of the first. Consciousness exists. You are conscious right now watching this video. Consciousness is among the contingent things the necessary being grounds. Now, a ground must have at least the resources to produce what it produces. Not the same properties, nobody says the cause of a fire must itself be burning, but sufficient capacity. A cause that lacks even the capacity for what it allegedly produces is not a sufficient ground of it. And much as physicalists and reductionists would wish otherwise, consciousness has resisted every attempt at reduction. This is the so-called heart problem, and it is not a temporary ignorance that better neuroscience will clear up. It is a gap between two kinds of description. Physical description tells you about structure, function, and dynamics, what things are made of, how they are arranged, how they change over time. Experience is none of those. No inventory of structure and dynamics, however complete, entails that there is something it is like to be the thing described. If that is right, then an impersonal, non-conscious substrate is not merely an unexplained ground of consciousness. It is a ground that lacks the relevant capacity entirely, whereas if the necessary ground already has something analogous to mind, consciousness in creatures is not inexplicable emergence. It is a downstream reflection of what is already present at the foundation. This is then a second layer of abduction. At the first layer, we were arguing for a selector among alternatives, the second for the ground of consciousness. And in both cases, personhood explains what impersonal physical reality cannot. So, this does not prove the ground is conscious. It says, given that consciousness exists and resists physical reduction, a mind-like ground explains it and a mindless ground does not. Two independent lines starting from different facts, arriving at the same place. So here is the scoreboard of the abductive competition. The challenger's candidate, energy and law as an impersonal necessary ground, fails twice over. It fails empirically, energy is not conserved where it matters, the shuffle winds down, and the winding up mechanisms are unconfirmed and entropy troubled. And it fails structurally. An impersonal ground cannot produce a contingent world at all. Either it makes that world entirely necessary, or it requires a selecting agency it does not possess. And it cannot ground consciousness with resources it does not have. My candidate is forced by the same facts that broke his. The world is contingent, so the ground selects, and selection is will. The world contains consciousness, so the ground has at least a capacity for consciousness. Now, what I do not get. The argument delivers at least one necessary being, that is the source and ongoing sustainer of all contingent reality, that has something analogous to will, and that possesses at least the resources to produce consciousness and intelligence. That is a great deal. It is also not the God of the Apostles' Creed. It does not deliver a one unique God, and nothing here shows the ground is benevolent. It does not deliver a communicating God. Nothing here shows it speaks, reveals, or cares. It does not deliver the God of Abraham, the God of Israel, or the Father of Jesus Christ. It does not deliver anything about uniqueness, moral character, or love, or providence, or salvation. What it delivers is generic theism, a necessary, self-existent, agent-like ground of all contingent reality. Everything beyond that, every specifically Christian claim in this series, requires other evidence and other arguments. That is what the remaining videos are for. If God exists, why is his existence so experientially weak? Why does he hide? This is a reasonable objection to make. Intuitively, one would expect the master of the universe to be something or someone clearly visible or at least detectable by the modern machinery that amplifies our natural senses. But that is not the case. So the absence seems to count as evidence against the master. But I have a few things to say about this reasoning. First, it needs qualification. God's existence is experientially weak for modern Western educated people. Across history and across cultures, reports of direct encounter with the supernatural are extraordinarily common. What is unusual is not the hiddenness. What is unusual are the specific cultural conditions under which the hiddenness becomes chronic and endemic. Second, the hiddenness is asymmetric. God's existence is experientially weak at the level of propositional certainty, but it is experientially strong at the level of the sensibilities, conscience, the sense of dependence, the cognitive tendency toward transcendent agency, the aesthetic response to natural forms. The complaint of hiddenness may be, in part, a complaint that God does not show up through the channels we have decided count as real evidence, while ignoring the channels through which something is, in fact, showing up constantly. Third, there is a structural reason. A necessary being, the ground of all contingent reality, cannot show up the way contingent objects do. If the necessary being really is the ground of everything contingent, its presence would not be a presence alongside other things, but the background condition that makes all other presences possible. It is not clear how we would or could detect such an existence through our natural or technologically augmented external senses. And fourth, and with all that said, I think this external invisibility remains a real cost to the argument. The qualifications weaken the objection, but they do not kill it. If a personal ground exists, one might still reasonably have expected it to be more accessible than it is. But notice that it is a cost the alternative pays too, and pays worse. The challenger's impersonal ground is no more detectable than mine. Nobody has ever observed the brain, a bulk, an eternal indestructible substrate, or the granular geometry that loop quantum gravity requires. The naturalist candidate is every bit as hidden from our senses and our instruments as the theistic one. And unlike the theistic one, it has no structural account of why it should be hidden. Its invisibility is simply a brute inconvenience. So the ledger reads like this. Both grounds are undetectable by external senses. Mine has a structural explanation for that undetectability. A ground of all contingent things is not itself a contingent thing to be found among them, and it explains contingency, selection, and consciousness. Theirs has no explanation for its own hiddenness, and it fails on contingency, on selection, on consciousness, and on the physics. So, with all that said, let me be precise about what we have established and what we have not. We've established that there exists a necessary being, uncaused, self-existence, having the ground of its existence in its own nature. This being is the ultimate source and ongoing ground of all contingent reality. This being has something analogous to will because the existence of contingent reality was not necessary. This being has at least the resources to produce consciousness and intelligence because these exist among the contingent beings it grounds. And what this argument didn't establish is that this being is infinite in all perfections, that this being is morally good, that this being communicates with creatures, that this being is the god of any particular religious tradition, that this being's existence is obvious or experientially unmistakable. So the contingency argument delivers claim 1 of the Apostles' Creed. God exists. It delivers it at high confidence. I would say probably between 85 to 90%. And the remaining 10 to 15 represents the possibility that one or more of the premises is false, that contingent brute facts are real, or that the necessary ground is something radically different from what theists have traditionally meant by God. The rest of the creed, monotheism, Trinity, Christ's divinity, resurrection, immortality, requires further argument, further evidence, and further investigation. Each of these will receive its own treatment in future work. Now, I want to end by saying what this argument is not. It doesn't prove anything. 3 of its 4 premises are close to undeniable, but the 4th is a judgment call, and I have flagged it as such every time it came up. Premise 4 says that a chain of contingent things, each passing the depth of its existence to the next, never actually pays a debt, and that the demand can only be met by something that does not reproduce it. That is an explanatory judgment, and hence the many objections I had to answer against it. I said this before in the video, but I should highlight this fact about the argument. It's not an argument for Christianity. It gets you a necessary ground with something like will and the capacity for consciousness. It does not get you a good God, a speaking God, or the God of Abraham. Anyone who tells you the contingency argument delivers the Christian God is overselling it. What it does get you is the first claim of the creed, and the one everything else hangs from. If there is no necessary ground, there is no God. If there is no God, the rest of the creed is a story about a man who died a horrible death, thinking he was the savior of humanity, and stayed dead like everybody else. So, this is where the series has to start. Not because it is the easiest claim, but because nothing else stands without it.